we're going to get started in just a few minutes. We're letting people log on, and we'll give them another minute or so, and then we'll get rolling.
I see something in the chat while everybody's waiting to put in the chat where you're logging in from.
Yes.
So we get to see that. That's fun. So we'll start in a couple minutes. Everybody logs in and put in the chat. Where are you logging in from?
Yeah, put your name and where you're coming to us from. That'd be great. Looks like some people already know. Good morning. Good morning. Hello, North Carolina.
Beach Lake, Montour School District.
Yeah, we are. Have my mask. Hey, Morella.
I see some Kennebec people. Hello, Kennebec.
She's a local author.
Vermont.
Yeah, we got a lot of states.
Gettysburg. Kim. Okay, just another minute here. We'll go ahead and get started, and be sure to use all of our time. We have a lot to talk about today. All right. For those of you who have joined us so far, welcome and thank you for joining this morning. I'm so excited to be here at Montour School District and the Media Center. It's beautiful. There's a fireplace behind me for this actual fireside chat with these amazing panelists that we're going to hear from today. I'm Lindsay Covert, CEO and founder of TEAMology, but I'll talk more about that later. But we're here today to talk about the importance of social emotional learning and the innovation in technology, especially now, that's rising in popularity around the importance and significance for our children and really for everyone during this global pandemic. Agenda for today, really, we're going to make this pretty easy and quick. We're going to do some introductions. Each of our panelists will introduce themselves and give you a little bit of background. We're going to have some discussions the first half of the event, and then Q&A from the audience. We really want to hear from those of you who are tuning in. I know that Elise is going to be putting some information in the chat. We are going to be pulling names to get prizes every 15 minutes. So if you've added to the conversation in the chat, your name will be pulled to win a prize. And we do have some really awesome
nice prizes
here.
Thank you, WQED.
WQED, yes, thank you for offering. These are playtime pads and plug and plays. HDMI streaming sticks, and then this is really awesome, a cookbook, Scratch Kids cookbook for kids.
Chris Fenimore.
And we also have some gift cards that we're going to be giving away. So be sure to you can start now putting questions in the chat, and we'll be pulling names every 15 minutes. All right, so let's get started. We're going to start with Randy Fox, who's the director for the Center for Safe Schools. Randy, if you could just go ahead and give an introduction, we'll move on from there, each of you.
Thank you, Lindsay, and it's a pleasure to be here, everyone. I'm Randy Fox. I'm the director of the Center for Safe Schools in Pennsylvania. We are US accredited by the Department of Justice and School Safety, and one of, I believe, 23 centers in the nation to representing Pennsylvania in comprehensive school safety. It's nice to be here.
Thank you, Randy. And Peggy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Peggy Schooling. I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania School Study Council and a professor of practice in the Ed Leadership Department at Penn State University at University Park. I'm also a former school and district administrator, hailing from the School District of Lancaster. And I've also worked in the private sector and have had really the privilege of working with small, large districts all over the country. I'm really happy to be here because part of the mission of the Pennsylvania School Study Council is really to help bridge research and practice and provide opportunities to the field on professional development and technical assistance on issues really pertinent to our members. And certainly COVID and what has been happening with COVID is clearly an issue, as well as how are we supporting our students, our faculty, our staff, our families, and even our administrators as we navigate through this pandemic in terms of their own social emotional learning and health. So I'm really happy to be here today.
Thank you, Peggy. Gina.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gina Masiola, and I am from WQED, part of their education team there. My role is to really create partnership opportunities, find organizations and people who are like-minded, who are doing the work out in communities in Southwestern Pennsylvania, and help to use our media created by PBS and WQED to really spark imagination and innovation and hands-on learning. So I try and find those partners and those people and those organizations and infuse our resources and content into what they're doing to really try and bridge that home to school connection. So yeah, that's kind of my role there now.
Happy to have you. And just keeping in mind, no masks, but we are socially distanced here
Absolutely.
at Montour. and Justin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Justin Alio. I'm the Director of Academic Achievement and District Innovation at Montour School District. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for being here today, and Gina and everyone, all the panelists. We're so excited to partner with TEAMology to teach social emotional learning. But it's also professionally, but personally, I'm invested in social emotional learning. I have a 13-year-old, 11-year-old, and an 8-year-old. So I live it every day at home. So what I learned from TEAMology and social emotional learning at school, I take home and I apply it at home and I live it at home and see it every single day. So thank you, Lindsay, for having us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Those introductions were great. We're going to jump right in and get this conversation started. Randy. Okay, there's a little bit of a glare. Sorry, Randy. There you are. So we're going to start off, Randy, with your background in school safety and security. What does social emotional learning have to do with school safety?
Yeah, Lindsay, it's a great question, and I'm going to answer that directly, but I want to give a little background first, is that for the last decade, it's been so common for schools to put in place physical safety items. Could be bollards, locks, window film, things like this. And those physical safety items are always a necessity, always important and always a priority, and I support that completely. But what we started to see across the state and the nation is that schools that provide some social emotional scaffolds for kids, parents, and their communities really focus on a comprehensive safety plan. And that means that you want to make sure that your emotional learning skills are solid to support your curriculum, and in turn create an environment when you bring children in and send them out at the end of the day that really complements that physical security. One of the things I've liked about this position is the fact that we focus on comprehensive safety, which is not only looking at the physical, but also looking at the school climate and culture. And a big part of that is the social emotional skills competencies.
Thanks, Randy. I have a quick, just a follow-up question on that. I had a recent conversation around this, just in terms of our society. Traditionally, we like to see things happen quickly, right? We like to see results quickly. And when it comes to social emotional, oftentimes to see the results, maybe, I mean, it's a preventative measure, so it's going to prevent things from happening. So you may not see things right away, but would you say that it can be more challenging to convince educators that social emotional is a priority over other things?
I think it really comes down to a leadership and commitment issue, Lindsay. If a district's able to build a coalition around a common vision of what they want to achieve in their strategic planning, and if they have a 2 to 3 to 4 year goal, and they're able to lead correctly where they can bring the coalition together on board, and those that aren't necessarily on the board will come along based on the results that they see. But it is most definitely no instant fix. You could have a company come in and physically prepare your building in a week and it's done, and you can show your constituents where the money went. The social emotional learning will require a strategic vision and leadership to move your district at all levels forward. So it does take a commitment, but I can tell you once you see the results, it's truly remarkable.
And that leads right into you led into my next question perfectly. So what can you give confidence to administrators that they should be seeing with a good and solid social emotional strategy? What kinds of outcomes?
Yeah, when you go into that, I mean, you're asking about the results that they would see if they implement it correctly?
Right.
Really, you want to look at your baseline data. So when you're entering into any type of commitment for a long-term plan, what is your discipline data? What is your attendance data? What is your counselor referral data? What are the common themes from your staff and community and students at certain times, depending on their levels? And listen and listen and listen and get that input, get that feedback, and incorporate it into a vision that uses those common themes. What that does is helps to build ownership in the fact that the leadership of the district or school has listened to your different constituents, identified common themes, and then you're moving forward in a way that is very hard for people to refute because they had a piece of that vision making, and then the strategic planning process can begin.
Great, thank you for that answer. And then, Peggy, I'm going to jump into a question for you that probably is a nice follow up from some of Randy's questions. Can you talk about the direct concerns right now of upper leadership in education?
Sure. I really think that number one, the major concern right now is continuity of education. We're not really out of the pandemic yet, and schools really across Pennsylvania and across the country are experiencing the results of the pandemic very differently. And some of that has to do with polarization, of the pandemic, and that has created some challenges for communities. And continuity is a big one right now. Making sure that you can shift fluidly and flexibly from one modality to another. Like, so here in Pennsylvania, people are moving from face-to-face to a hybrid to remote, sometimes, on a, very frequently and rapidly changing, schedule. So I think that's a big one. And I think, I know, because I just came off of a call yesterday with probably 300 school districts in Pennsylvania, that social emotional learning and the support of students and families and community is a very big concern of superintendent and system leaders right now. This is, we're unprecedented level of change is really, really, creates stress for everybody, not just kids, but the adults in the system. I think that folks are also, because we're in this distance education context, that folks are really trying to think about and be creative about how to support the needs of students. So while we feel like this might be kind of emergency and crisis, and it is, the pandemic is also kind of inspired and revealed and even accelerated innovation in some places. So I think that's important. I think that, I think the other concern is really also about how do we address the needs of our most vulnerable students? And so how do we make sure that we create a system, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's remote, or whether it's a hybrid, that addresses the needs of those students? And I think, and many of my colleagues think, that if we would create a system that addresses our most vulnerable system, that system will work for everybody. So I think that's important. And probably, it goes without saying that the rapidly changing conditions in terms of interpreting health and safety guidelines are a concern, as well as the budgetary impacts that all of these changes and shifts are that are taking place are certainly on the minds of school and system leaders for sure.
And that actually leads into a really good question that you may not or may be able to answer, Peggy. Do you believe we're allocating enough funds to social emotional learning and education? Not to put you on the spot.
That's a good question. I think the short answer is no. I think, in education, we would all argue that there's really never enough funds to do what is required in schools. But I do think that in recent years, there's been some really interesting research from an economic perspective on social emotional learning and, that sort of dollar cost benefit idea. And some of that research is finding that for every dollar spent, it yields $11 in benefits. And what I'm hopeful about that is that recognition of the dollar cost benefit actually appeals to legislators in many ways, because they're always looking at that. So I'm hopeful about that. I also think that there's, continually a large number of research that is suggesting that by increasing social emotional skills, we really do support academic learning for students. So I think that's important. And also, one of the challenges is that districts generally rely on state and federal grants as well as private foundations for funding in this area. And, that's going to be, I think, problematic in the future because of the current economic situation that we're in. So while I think I'm eternally hopeful, I'm not overly optimistic, but I do think that the research is driving towards helping to facilitate more funding in some areas.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to bounce back to you, Randy, in terms of funding. Is there an opportunity through school safety? Can schools rely on a funding stream that is already allocated to school safety and make an argument for social emotional learning?
Well, it's interesting because over the summer, the state came out with a direct grant for school districts for COVID-19. Now, by no means did it cover all costs, but hopefully that helped in some way for the percentages of costs of schools having to shift for a variety of ways for COVID. They've recently they're coming out with a second grant. It hasn't been announced yet. That grant's going to be a little looser. It's still going to be directly related to COVID-19, but it has less parameters wrapped around it so that it gives districts more flexibility to use that money in ways that might be differentiated for them. One of those ways may be to assess mental health needs, emotional needs, which ties right into social emotional learning. And I have nothing to do with the grants or their approval or dispersion or anything like that. We're in a new world, and I can't imagine that type of support is going to go away. And I know that it is a priority for the state.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And Justin, I'm going to bounce over to you because I think it's important to bring in your administrator hat to the conversation. Before the pandemic, you did spend a lot of time traveling and talking to large groups of people in education around innovation. And was social emotional learning a point of focus prior to the pandemic in some of those conversations?
Well, I think the key word you hit was pre-COVID, going to conferences.
Yes.
So I guess if I had to reflect back on the previous conferences, the last one I attended was actually in South Beach, Miami, which was nice in January at the Future of Educational Technology Conference at VTC. And, great presenters in general. Heard a lot of great presenters, Eric Schinninger, Rochelle Pott, Ken Shelton. And when often they talk about programs, technology, innovation, or anything like that, great presenters always tie in social and emotional learning anyways, no matter what the theme of the conference is. That's what makes them great presenters, because they understand that in order to accomplish great things in school districts, you have to have that social and emotional aspect, the culture piece, the people piece in those conversations. But previous, in November of 2019, I was the keynote speaker for the Mid-Atlantic Personalized Learning Conference in Atlanta, Georgia. And the theme of that conference, I'm personalized learning was social and emotional learning. And the opening keynote speaker of that conference is my good friend Tom Murray. And he actually just came out with a new book called Personal and Authentic that addresses those issues. So to answer your question, we are seeing a shift in conferences and in best practices to more social and emotional learning. And it's always been one of those things where we looked at, kind of triaged it first and said, okay, who needs it? Now we're seeing an umbrella that everyone needs it, especially now. And that shift was already happening before COVID, but after COVID and during COVID, we're seeing it now happening at a rapid pace.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And Gina, I'm going to pull you into some of what we're talking about. Decades before educators were familiar with the term social emotional learning, Fred Rogers was teaching lessons that would turn out to be timeless. What do you think his message might be for kids, educators, and parents struggling in this pandemic right now?
I think his message would be what it always is: to move slowly, take time, make real connections, and always look for the helpers, right? I think that Fred's message is always about the connections that you have with people. And regardless of how remote we're learning, that the connection to the people is really what is important and what counts. And I think as long as we keep that in the forefront of whatever and however we connect, I think we'll be successful.
Love that. Love that. And Justin, I heard you say, there is this idea that social emotional learning is really something that's meant for preschoolers, or I've even heard educators in leadership positions say, well, not all of our students need social emotional learning. What's your response to that?
So, as a parent, as someone who studied child development, family relations, early intervention, everybody needs a little bit of social and emotional learning. I've taught with the Allegheny Intermediate Unit for a long, long time before I took on this role at WQED. And one of the big reasons I decided to make that shift was because my children were attending a school where technology was moving quickly. And because I hadn't been in school for several years, felt like I was not able to keep up with everything they were learning, with everything that was happening in the classroom, with smart boards and iPads and all of the stuff that was starting to come down. And it was really important for me to be able to embed myself in what was happening in their classroom, in what was happening with teachers, what was happening with students, what was happening with parents. The flip side of that, I was still teaching, and I was starting to get inundated with technology in my own classroom. So I was starting to get smart boards, I was starting to get iPads. We were getting all of these grants that were putting this tech in my space, in this Head Start classroom. What I wasn't getting as part of that was the support I needed to integrate that and to add that into my classroom. And so it seemed like, it took a really long time for technology and innovation, hundreds and hundreds of years for things to be developed. And all of a sudden, kids of all ages were getting this stuff dumped in their laps. Yeah. And so it was important for me to join an organization like WQED to help my own learning, and then to be able to support the learning that's happening in my classroom and of the community of parents that were looking to me for some answers.
So you quickly adapted to, you had to adapt to the technology at that time, which leads me to ask, this is kind of an open question for all of you. Over the last 6 to 8 months, we've watched the impact that the pandemic had across education, right? And some districts were more prepared than others in terms of how to kind of make this work and how were students going to learn. And the struggle has been real for many. I'm a parent, and I have many friends in education, and we've just watched everybody get through. When you said that, at one point in time, you were adapting. How do you think now that you're shifted and you've been with WQED and you're watching all of this unfold with social emotional learning? How do you think we've had to adapt in terms of the world of technology, and how does that impact students social emotionally? It's a loaded question, but that's for anyone.
I'll jump in and piggyback off Gina talking
Yeah,
about
please do.
Fred Rogers. Fred Rogers, the first episode was in February 1968. My favorite episode, black and white, debuted on PBS. And in that first episode, King Friday was totally against change. King Friday did not like change in any place in the land of make-believe. He was getting so frustrated. Well, when Trolley came back from the land of make-believe and told Mr. Rogers, beep, 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 talking to Mr. Rogers, he told Mr. Rogers that King Friday did not like change. He was getting very upset with change. Well, Mr. Rogers said that he knew someone that changed his bed from this side of the room to that side of the room. And they woke up the next day. They said, gee, you know what? I've got some new ideas, and change is good. So here's Mr. Rogers 52 years ago talking about how change is good, and how we need change in the first very episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So as we go through this changing environment, we need to embrace this because we need new ideas. We have thousands and millions of kids across the country that every single day have the sense of fearlessness and a sense of optimism to do great things. So how can we as educators and adults embrace this by not just pulling out the best of academics out of them, but pulling out what's best with their learning by addressing them to be comfortable at school, be comfortable with themselves, with others, in order to pull the best out of them, to create those ideas to change the world for a better place, like Mr. Rogers said 52 years ago.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. I love that you're thinking. Yes, Peggy.
I would piggyback on that too. I think, if you look back on the history of public education, like we've always had this mandate to provide, quality education to all students, which means we've historically tried to adapt to the circumstances that we're in. I mean, if you look back, public schools have changed in relation to what happens in the world, right? And we continue to do that. And it's pretty clunky right now because we're still trying to find our way. But I do think, there's some fundamental questions that I think we all have to be thinking about. And one is, I think that we've, before I sort of raise these questions, I want to add also that we've really shifted the role fundamentally of parents in this pandemic in terms of education. It's really put amazing responsibilities and in some cases burdens on our families. And so we're going to really have to think about that. But when I think about what do we do? I think, we have to think about what is it that learners do? We have to start thinking about what do learners do and how do they behave in all these environments, and what and how do learners think, and how do they think in all these different environments that we're trying to help them with? And then also, how do learners feel? And that gets to the social emotional piece of it, and then who do learners interact with, which is the social pieces of it, right? I think if we start thinking about those questions, I think we'll be able to kind of unpack some of the issues that are concerning all of our students, our faculty, our staff, our administrators in trying to design environments for kids where they can be successful. And I do agree with Randy. I mean, any kind of systems approach to anything requires a 2, 3, even longer year commitment. And I want people to think about, social emotional learning is not an add-on. This is about what we do. As I was an early childhood teacher too, and one of the concepts that really resonated to me throughout my entire life comes from international preschool education. And it's the idea that the environment is the second teacher in the room. And when I think about that, it makes me think a lot about how we create and structure the learning environment to support kids in their success. And that means really integration of social emotional learning. And that also means taking care of ourselves. I think about being on an airplane, how you're supposed to give the oxygen mask to your kids and everybody else before you take your own. And I think there's a really strong recognition that we have to think about how do we take care of the adults in the system, and think really carefully about that, because sometimes health and social emotional activities for teachers embedded in the school day may actually be burdensome to some. And so we have to think about what works for whom. And I think that's a big question too. What works for whom? And how do we know it works? And what is the evidence that we have to support differentiated strategies for, for all kids?
Wow.
Lindsay, I'd like to weigh in on that for a quick second. I agree with everything everybody said. I may have a little bit of a different twist. But given the fact that schools around the nation are going to be on, off, or a blended virtual program, depending on the emotional needs of parents in the homes, I don't think there's ever been a time for a greater need for social emotional support, because depending on what that family situation is like, we now just took a child, put them in an environment that might be caustic, and instead of them coming to school where it's the best part of their day, they're now 24/7 in that same environment. And where there can be a deterioration for some kids. And what I'm getting at is supporting Peggy's comment about this isn't an add-on, but it's very easy and effective to integrate it with what teachers and schools are already doing, so that it's not one more thing for them, but embedded in their core curriculum, so that all students get a broad base of support. And then we can tier it in a response to instruction and intervention model for an additional tier 2 and tier 3 supports. But I think this time is most crucial, and we've seen it locally where I live. We've seen it nationally as far as the referrals and things like that are going up. I do want to give a quick shout out to Gettysburg. That's my hometown. I was born there. I saw an individual on there, and I saw Keith Shoemaker from Eastern York. I'm a constituent of Eastern York. We reside in that district and couldn't be happier with them. So saw they were on. I wanted to say something before I forgot.
And thanks, Randy. And there was a lot to unpack, I think, between everything that you guys have just said. One thing that I'd like to highlight is the integration of social emotional into everyday curriculum. And I think my colleagues and I have been in enough trainings now where there are many educators prepared to do that, and can understand that pretty easily, and it's pretty seamless. But I will say, it does take some effort. It does take some training and some understanding, and sometimes there can be some resistance with that, to be quite honest. So I'm going to go back to you, Justin, in terms of bringing in social emotional. I know you're working with TEAMology. How did you identify that to be a priority? I mean, I know we've clearly talked about how the pandemic has really raised that priority all over the world, really. But what were those initial meetings like? What were the conversations? How did your teachers respond? How did you plan for TEAMology and social emotional learning?
So that's a big question. I think, first of all, Montour School District, one of the things I think we do really well, starting from our school board to our superintendent, Dr. Stone, is that we listen and support our community and our community's needs. And even before COVID, social and emotional learning kept coming up over and over again. During the spring, we had to shut down across the state. Social and emotional learning came up even more. So we knew coming into this school year, it just wasn't about training teachers on social and emotional learning, how to incorporate it within classes. It's making it a district goal. And so coming into the school year, we had a couple options for our kids. A, come back full-time, face-to-face. B, remote teaching with video cameras in the classroom. And C, cyber school option, all asynchronous learning. We gave families any option they wanted to do. So since August, and now looking into the end of October today, we're still face-to-face, one of 3 schools in Allegheny County. We have about maybe 70% capacity back to school, because a lot of families, a lot of students want school because they need it for their students' wellness. So coming into the school year, we had really 3 goals. We had now categorized them into 2 sections. 1A being physical safety. How can we create social distancing, cleaning, all those things that CDC recommends, Allegheny Health Department, and so forth. But 1B, social and emotional learning. And to address that, we had to find a program like TEAMology to give our teachers support in the classroom to teach all students. And so I give a huge shout out to our teachers for really taking what they needed, that they knew that what needed to be done, but also embracing that and teaching it every day. Our second grade teachers teach it every day, 30 minutes, social and emotional learning. So it's not just about embedding social and emotional into the curriculum, but it's intentionally teaching social and emotional learning.
Right.
We can embed everything and say that, oh, we embed this, we embed that. I think sometimes it's a cover up sometimes to say we're doing it. But if you can dedicate 30 minutes every day to one thing, you're really teaching that. And then you start embedding it. We've had this growth mindset, part of our core values for 5 years now. Every day we teach growth mindset. And you can see that when kids matriculate up to the grade levels. Teachers are like, oh, the growth mindset's amazing because we can teach that every day. The third piece is the academic piece moving into the school year and knowing that we have to teach differently this year as well. And that's okay. And we said, well, what happens if kids don't get to a certain place in their curriculum this year? That's okay. You know, we have to make sure they're safe in school, physically, socially, emotionally. Once we do that, the education is going to pick up naturally, but we have to address those skills. So going back to, we're intentionally made it a district goal, measurable goal, and we report that back out to the community. We share that with the community. This is our goal, folks, this year. We want students to be safe. We need to open our school buildings up for kids to come in and get therapeutic treatments, counseling, see their peers, to get 30 minutes every day on lessons on social and emotional learning. Those pieces are so important to us. And here we are at the end of August, we're still in school, and we have our ups and downs every day. Every day we walk in the building to say, okay, what's the new news today? But that's the world we live in.
Right.
We embrace it. We take it one day at a time. We have a mindset that it's going to be different every day. So again, going back, it has to be intentional every single day.
Resilience, and tons of resilience that you're using.
I totally agree with that, Justin, and I commend you and your district for taking the time out of what would be not normally considered the academic schedule to make time for that social and emotional learning. One thing that I think I've learned over the last 6 or 7 years, being on the other side of outside of the classroom and kind of on the media and resource creation side of it, is that it's so important to practice the social and emotional learning that we're teaching children, that we're trying to teach them, that we're trying to embed in learning. But it's really important to practice that, to give children the opportunity to engage with each other and work through some of that, not in the moment when social and emotional stakes are high, right? So to give them time, to give them tools, to give them words and scenarios that they can use as they move forward with their learning and with social and emotional wellness. I don't know that after preschool that we give kids and adults, right, time to work through that and to practice those skills. And if you were gonna, just as an example, if you were gonna play baseball, you wouldn't send a kid out onto the field to hit for the first time without having him use a tee or without having him practice that skill and expect him to be successful. So you can't sit when he's on at bat, say, oh, wait, you gotta like change your stance. Or I think it's really important to make sure we give kids the skills in those scenarios and then give them time to practice and act it out and pretend so that they're more successful when the time comes to really, use those in the moment.
To understand what to do and how to do it.
I jump in. So Gina said something that, when we think like, getting kids to practice something.
Yeah.
So when it's time to play, they're good at it, right?
Right.
The T-ball. So for years, school districts, why do you teach digital citizenship? Why do you teach social and emotional learning? Why do you give kids opportunities? Why do you hire extra psychologists to come in and work with your students? Why do you have extra groups and counseling groups and so forth? That was pre-COVID. Why do your focus should be math, reading, this and that, and not focus sometimes on that. But if you value those things and you're given resources, the benefit of it is COVID, we shut down. But I think that doing all those things prior to that helped us not have a successful shutdown in March, April, May, or June, but it helped us prepare to be better. Prior to COVID, we hired more psychologists. We dedicated a lot of time to working with students. We hired more teachers to address these needs. But we also did at the high school. We have a Speak to Me room that we started 2 or 3 years ago, where students are trained counselors. And any time of the day you feel like you need to just go relax, just go on your phone, your app, and go into the Speak to Me room. You go sit for 20 minutes, relax. After 20 minutes, a student counselor checks in with you. After 40 minutes, an adult counselor checks in with you.
Yeah.
Anytime, because often, like, say if I'm a high school student and I come to you, Lindsay, you're the math teacher, and I'm coming in third period, you have a test, and I say, Miss Lindsay, my girlfriend just broke up. I mean, the first response to the teacher is what? Hey, there's many fish in the sea.
Yeah.
Come in, this test is really important. That's going to make you successful in this life. But to a 16-year-old, that's their life.
Right.
They can care less about
Yep.
that test. So they're coming in already with a messed up mindset into your class. Now we give the students the opportunity to say, the teacher is saying, hey, you know what, go to Speak to Me room. When you're ready, come back to our personalized learning time and take this assessment. Kid goes in there, they get their mindset, they do what they need to do to come back and really focus on that math. And then they have time built in to go get that emotional check. So I think it's important, the one lesson we learn, whether it's social, emotional, or anything, the time we invest in schools, not just because it's nice to do, but situations like COVID and other situations do come up in life. And if we teach those skills beforehand, we're much better off.
Yes, absolutely. There's so many ways I could go to kind of follow up on things that you all have said. Couple things that are I'm taking away. Intention is critical when you're bringing in social emotional commitment, leadership. You know, I recently was kind of back and forth with the school district and realized that there were no goals. There was no vision. And if you don't have a vision and goals for social emotional, then how can you get your staff to understand what you're trying to do? So I really applaud you for that as well, and kind of shifting what that vision is based on the pandemic and how things are changing. One thing I want to go back to, Peggy, I think you had mentioned a little bit ago, was the social emotional wellness of teachers and adults, really. As a former counselor, I think it's really important to think through, as we're trying to teach social emotional students, we ourselves have to understand our own and be aware of our own emotions and our own mental health needs. How are, in general, and this is kind of an open question for everyone, how are districts addressing the needs of teachers right now and providing that support and that guidance?
Well, I think you're right. And I think there is a widespread recognition from district leaders that there's a need to take care of their teachers. Again, it's unprecedented times, crisis, fluidity. It's, as they used to say in the military, the fog of war, like it's uncertain, right, where we're headed and what the next direction is. And all of that creates a level of stress that I think everybody's living with, right? And then if you're a teacher and you also are a parent, you have additional stresses there too in terms of educating your own children. So I think districts are really aware of that. I think that some folks are having sort of morning check-ins with people, daily check-ins afterwards. I think they're also being conscious of, like, what do teachers need? A big part of what's been happening with some districts, so if you keep going back to that systems approach, social emotional is part of learning, right? It's not a separate thing out there. It is part of learning. So district leaders who get that understand how to integrate it better, right? So what are they doing for teachers? They're thinking about and having conversations about, what does social emotional learning look like for me in this space, in a face-to-face environment, in a hybrid, in a virtual? What does that look like? What is it that you need? And starting, you know, it goes back to teaching and learning. What is it that we have to think about and do differently, right? So think about that. You know, prior to the pandemic, you know, teachers by and large were working in their classrooms. Maybe they were part of a professional learning community, but by and large, teaching was happening in their classroom by themselves. Now, you know, a lot of visionary superintendents are thinking about how do you reposition and redeploy staff in working together in teams, right? Because the knowledge doesn't lie with one person, it lies within a group of people. We all have strengths and weaknesses. So that idea of working together in a team to maybe co-teach, while that can create stresses for people, it also creates opportunities to really think together. I think that's important for social emotional support. I also think some really highly effective leaders are pushing on some questions about things educationally that we've done for a long time that may not work in this environment. Like, what is the difference between attendance and participation? What does engagement look like? You know, my son, who's going to be 30 next week, reminded me just yesterday of the infamous conversation he had with his high school teacher on the first day of school. And I asked him, you know, what did you learn today? And he said, I learned that I could look at the teacher and smile and she thinks I'm paying attention. So I'm always reminded of that idea of like engagement. So how do we take stress off for teachers about trying to replicate, because we can't replicate the face-to-face. Distance education was never intended, nor should it replicate the face-to-face environment. There are different pedagogies that work for different purposes. And I think it's really important to give teachers permission to think about those things differently. Like, it's okay. Think about it. We are not going to put kids on 5 hours of Zoom. We can't stand more than an hour as an adult, right? So like, how do we relieve that stress of teachers' paradigm about what education has been and give them permission to be more creative and think creatively to do what makes sense? I saw a question on the chat about like preschool and kindergarten and remote. I spent most of my career leading pre-K and K in a large urban district, school district of Lancaster. And I've recently had the privilege of actually sneaking in on some instruction with some of those teachers. And I got to tell you, maybe it's my bias, but preschool teachers are some of the most creative people that I know, early childhood, and they are doing some really innovative stuff online. So I think, you know, that's an important part of the social emotional learning is give people permission. And I know Justin says this too, give people permission to innovate and take risks. That reduces stress too, for some.
Thank you, Peggy. And I am seeing some questions in the chat. Just a reminder, I will be announcing a couple of winners at 10:30, 2 winners, but please keep your chat coming, and we're going to be moving into audience questions and feedback here in just a few minutes. But this leads right into Peggy. You know, this event was really inspired by the idea of social emotional learning and innovation and technology, and how do they intersect? And I think kind of let's position the next question is really for you, Justin. You work with a variety of innovators, companies, organizations, and education. Are companies creating technology and innovation to promote social and emotional wellness? If so, do you think it will be successful?
For answer that question, I will say that teachers, it's very stressful for everybody across the board. I applaud them so much for what they do. And, you know, we talk about take one day at a time. Never feel like you're alone. 1 minute at a time. Never feel like you're alone. Check in. But it's very challenging, and challenging for the companies as well, especially when you hear the big companies that are laying people off because they're not buying books, you know, whatever it is. And a lot of the big companies we work with are laying people off. And some of the companies we work with also, the technology companies, because a lot of school districts are remote, their volume is going up, but they don't have maybe the staff to keep up either. So I know they're struggling as well. But when it comes to social emotional learning with these companies, I did not see a big, you know, output of products on their end. I think at the end of the day, when you look at a school district's budget, it's still math and reading. Obviously, like we said before, there's a shift happening because of need, where school districts are saying, I need to pay for social and emotional learning. So I'm hoping some companies do. And I've worked with some companies in the past that have some really nice tools, Play Power Labs, and some other companies. But in general, I don't see a big shift. And there are many companies out there that I know that are doing some things, but it's a tough time in education for the companies, not just for educators as well, though.
I see that too. And so I think that's where partnerships and other nonprofit organizations can really step in and help to offer some support in that space. You know, one of the things that we try to do in a space where it's filling some of those gaps and some of those holes when we're talking with administrators, when we're talking with teachers, when we're talking with parents and grandparents and caregivers, is to be that piece, right? For WQED, for just nonprofit organizations to be those supports and to come in and listen to what schools need, what communities need, and build some of that and be able to offer that as part of what we can do to help support the community. And so it's really important, you know, for those partnerships to bubble and to rise to the surface so that we're all working together to really create supports for all of our communities and listening to the voices that they bring to the table. So I think there's really a space to create, you know, we really talk about creating a learning environment, right? And to make sure that education doesn't revert back to what we saw before this disruption, to make sure that there are learning opportunities that go way beyond the four walls of a classroom, and to make sure that we're supporting that learning in a variety of environments across communities. So I think that as a nonprofit organization and as a media organization, you know, everybody has a lot of responsibility to step up and help fill gaps and create programming that will support teachers, families, and communities.
Thank you, Gina. I know I speak for everyone when I say we all appreciate your partnership and what WQED has offered before the pandemic and after this happened. It's amazing work, and I think we continue to find ways. You know, going back to what you said, Justin, I think everyone is experiencing a level of difficulty in some way, shape, or form. Whether you're a school, whether you're a company, nonprofit organization, and I think disruption opens the door to innovation. And there's the opportunity, as long as you find the right partnerships and you have a good vision, you know, there's ways to get through and create hopefully better things for, in our case, students and educators.
Lindsay, can I talk about innovation for a second?
Please do, yes.
So Monday, we had the privilege to host a new director for the League of Innovative Schools, Wayne, from the Digital Promise series. He gave him a tour of the school. And he said to me, he said, can your school district continue the innovation now that COVID's happening? And I said, well, first of all, I believe that innovation starts and as people, not programs, technology, Legos, Minecraft, whatever it is, esports. And so I do think through this pandemic that we're seeing a lot more innovation from teachers. And I always think about Randy Pouch's, the author of the last lecture, former professor at Carnegie Mellon University, said, the walls are built not to keep us out, but to show us how badly we want something. And I think of educators during this time as these superheroes that carry this hammer in the back, and they're just knocking down walls left and right because they see the kids on the other side, and they need to teach those kids. When you think about educators today, they're trying things that I don't want to say are back to the basics, but they really are. Relationships, culture, communication. Our remote teachers, every 2 weeks we have a pickup in front of the building for families to come pick up and drop off some supplies. And if it's a birthday, we have presents for those kids. We're having them drop off their projects. We're sending notes home for those students because even though they can't see those students, we still want to keep those relationships and just going to do what's best for kids at the end of the day. I mean, that's what it comes down to. Right. Do what's best for the kids. And innovation is not going to come from technology program. It's going to come from people, period.
That's great. Any other thoughts on that from Peggy or Randy?
Yeah, I would agree with Justin. You know, I've been in, I guess, in education 40 years, and, you know, the last 10 or 15, we've been talking about a lot about standards-driven education. And of course, that's been a good thing that we have identified standards for kids, but what has sort of we've moved away from, we've been an educator for as long as I have, that was very much about the whole child. When I first went into education, it was very much about meeting the needs of the whole child, social, emotional, and so forth, physical. And we moved away from that and moved into a standards-driven movement, which of course really did clarify what kids need to know and be able to do. But I think it's also really, really important to understand that nothing can take away the importance of a teacher building relationships with their students, creating a safe learning environment so that learning can occur. That's fundamental. And every good teacher who's on here knows that in their heart of hearts to be true. So you have to give yourself a little permission, right, to go back to that. And second, we know, and the research is like unequivocally clear on here. Technology is a tool that supports learning, not the other way around. And so I would say for teachers' social emotional health, there's been a lot of pressure to do all these great things, cute things, emojis, all bells and whistles, that create an undue amount of stress and pressure for teachers, some of which is self-imposed. Some of it comes from district and district leaders in their attempt to train teachers in the latest technology, okay? But think about fundamentally, it's about creating a relationship with your students so that they feel safe to learn, okay? Along with identifying what they need to know and be able to do, okay? And this is a curriculum issue, right? Identify what kids need to know and be able to do, and use your creativity as a teacher to help them get there, okay? And then think about how can I figure out ways to assess their learning, okay? And that's a challenge right now because we have to be creative. But I think fundamentally that's the most important part. And what we do know, I mean, here's the good news, okay? When I said earlier about, you know, what works, it depends, right? It depends. It depends. So we now have a great opportunity to be innovative and say, what kind of modality works best for kids and for whom? So some of the chat, for example, some people are saying, well, some kids do well learning in an online environment. That's absolutely correct. And there's some emerging research that I just heard about yesterday about, no surprise, that some kids who have social emotional learning issues or self-regulation issues actually do better in an asynchronous environment because they're choosing when is the best time for them to do their work, okay? On the other hand, we know that kids who have ADHD do better in a synchronous environment because they need structure. They need short periods of time to do their work. They need a schedule. You know, they need the little bell schedule. They need a place that is organized. So I think that's a really important thing for teachers to think about, and to think about like what works for whom and how do I know? How do I know?
Great, thanks, Peggy. That's all very helpful information. Any last thoughts from the panelists before we jump into questions from the audience? Okay, we're going to move right on to the questions. I do have a couple of winners to announce. Rick and
Congratulations, Rick. Yes.
Woohoo!
And I'm going to have Elisa, if you could help me. There was one other Amy. Oh, there's a couple Amy's on here, but Overly.
Yep,
Yes.
we had Amy Overly, and we also had a Marlene Urso. Those are our 3 winners so far.
Congratulations. And if the 3 of you could directly connect with Elisa, you can help them claim their prize.
Yes, I will be sending emails shortly.
Great. So continue putting those questions and thoughts into the chat, and we still have 5 more winners, I think. I think we had 8 total. Is that right? Elisa or Lisa?
Yes, yep, that sounds right.
So keep them coming. First question from Joanna. For those of us who don't have decision-making authority in schools, what's the best way to make suggestions and make an impact?
Well, I mean, I'll jump in. I know it sounds simple sometimes, but sometimes simple is the best.
Yeah.
It's just communicating with your decision-making people in your school building or district. Just over communicating, and also modeling to your peers what's working, what's not working. Asking your principal, superintendent, hey, I did this in my class. Can I share it? Because I was a principal for 10 years. That explains no hair on my head. I've been a district leader for 6 years. And when teachers come to me and say, I have an idea, can I share it? I want to say, yes, you may. We'll set up a time. But in my head, I'm thinking, thank you. Because it just takes a relief off the shoulders of administrators by having, because often, administrators, when we talk, I think it's tone deaf sometimes. But when peers can hear from peers, they accept it, but also they feel free, like they can follow up with questions after the fact too. They can try new things. We encourage, just in general, we encourage that so much here through action research projects, through different models of observations and evaluations. But in general, for those teachers or paraprofessionals or anyone, maybe an administrator does not have the decision making within the school district sometimes. It's just communicating, sharing, oversharing, and you know what? At the end of the day, it's just doing it sometimes and finding different ways to communicate that to everyone.
It's a great response. Relationship building is the other thing I was thinking.
Yeah. And I also would say, you may not have positional authority as a teacher, you have influence. And every teacher is a leader. So use that influence and feel empowered to make those suggestions. Because I would agree with Justin, I was an elementary principal and there are days where you're so in your head with other things that you can't think straight. And, a teacher will come with a very unique perspective and you're relieved. So I agree.
Use your voice. Great.
And, just to that point, when we're in a parent meeting and a parent may say to me, this is not the way I want it to go. I need it to go this way. I'm sorry if I'm not aligned sometimes. I'm being aggressive. I've had teachers come to me and say, hey, we need to do this now. I applaud people doing that because I look at them and I say, you know what? You should be upset sometimes because you are your child's number one advocate as a parent. You should be knocking down doors. And teachers, that's a baby. That's their baby in the class. They should advocate for those kids. And sometimes when an administrator says, you know what, I need time to think about it. Sometimes you gotta be a little forceful.
Push a little bit
Push
harder.
a little bit. Yeah.
Push a little bit harder.
You're the advocate. We have to remember that sometimes. Like these kids, they look to us as adults to advocate for them. And that's important that we do that.
Right. And you're never wrong when you're trying to do the right thing.
That's right. I was going to say, I as a former teacher as well, that a lot of times that change bubbles up from your staff, right? Like change doesn't happen overnight, ever. And a lot of times change that's significant and that sticks comes from within the school and not from the top down. And so I think it's really important for, the people who are working in that front line space to have those conversations and feel like they can go to their administrators to voice what's going on and to let them know. I think that that's really important. I think that that's where a lot of that, like I said, that permanent change comes from.
I saw a chat. Amy said that it's important that teachers also have a voice that they feel safe and comfortable to speak up. So it goes back to culture. As a parent, my kids go to Kennebec School District. And I know I have a great relationship with all the principals in that district. I've texted them sometimes and said, hey, this is going on. And they responded back right away to say, hey, I got this, we're gonna work through this. And I trust them. Like, I think that's another thing. Like, I trust that something's going to happen.
Yes.
Not, that they're going to address something that it could be the smallest or biggest thing in the world, but that trust that parent to school, that how that school builds that trust. Again, it goes back to, everything goes back to this one word, culture.
Yeah, and relationships.
Great. Yeah,
That's super
absolutely.
important.
And I would just add one last thing is always thinking about how you say it. Sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it.
Right.
I remember talking to my students about that a lot when I was in education. Sometimes you can say the exact same thing, but in two different ways and get a completely different result. So always important to be mindful of. Lisa Donovan has a question. Can the speakers give some examples of the success of SEL in their classrooms? So probably Justin geared more towards maybe some of the teachers and what they're doing in your school, or Peggy, if you've been, or maybe Randy, you do have some examples of some administrators or teachers that you're working with.
I mean, some examples of success are really, how are they benchmarking that data? It goes back to, I hear what everybody has said about the climate and culture and teachers being able to give input. I think that's a reflection on leadership. And a big part of building leadership, I did it for 25 years, along with some central office duties at times, is, what forums do you have in place to get the feedback? And then what forums do you have in place to take the good feedback and make sure that it produces results? So districts that I've seen consistently benchmark 2, 3, 5, 6 weeks, there are different benchmarks for what they look at. They do it consistently, and those benchmarking standards are across the district. And while they may be customized based on the population of the building, if they have that consistent assessment, they're going to find out the variables that they need to alter and differentiate for their schools and really come out and keep that data growing. So that's typically the model that I see. If I'm off on the question or the answer, or they have additional questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thanks, Randy. Anyone else?
I see it every day as teachers. They truly amaze me at their mindset that they have to build those relationships and teach them social emotional learning. But every little thing, from how they greet the students in the class, for taking time out to allow students to share, whether it's verbally. I know that during remote teaching, this may be a great example here. We have first grade, they use Seesaw as a way to communicate back and forth. And when they pose questions to the kids and say, hey, tell me how your day went, send me a video. The first grade teachers watch every single one of their videos every day, but also make their own video to every single student at the end of the day, commenting back to their video. How amazing is that?
That's awesome.
That the student receives a personalized video every day
They'll never
from
forget.
their teacher. Yeah, talk about the students saying, wow, they really listen to me and they care about me. And they're not talking about math or anything like that. They're just talking about ways they can support them in the classroom.
Great.
Oh, I love that. That kind of is exactly what we're talking about, right? Where the, innovation in this maybe media piece, right? And technology meets that relationship and social emotional piece to really create impact and change. I think that's so important.
And another example is, just off the top of my head, is kindergarten. They do remote teaching. And so you have families that have never been into the school building, ran into the community, and their child, because whatever reason, safety, just anything, they chose remote learning. Well, we wanted them to feel connected somehow. So our teachers planned, they said it's voluntarily only, you can come if you don't, whatever.
Right.
A trip to the park.
Oh,
So they planned after school one day, and they said 100% of the families showed up at the park
that's
just to
amazing.
see and meet each other, because they feel more connected to each other. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. Well, and I think in terms of social emotional, it can be really helpful, and I would say even really important, to have specific skills or things that the students are working to learn. Oftentimes we hear social emotional is difficult to learn and then to apply in our real life, right? And for kids, if we don't kind of give them specific direction and reinforce it and then help them to kind of put it into context, it's difficult to go from a classroom environment and then see the skill, on the playground or at home. So I think being very intentional about creating opportunities throughout the day in the classroom where a child can kind of make that connection of, and I'll use one of our characters, Harper, for helping others, constantly reinforcing the idea that, oh, look, you helped like Harper does. And then if the child hears that enough, when they go onto the playground, they're looking for helpers, going back to what you said with Mr. Rogers. So
Lindsay, on that note,
Yeah.
When we came into the school year and we made social emotional learning one of our 3 district goals, we wanted to give teachers the tools to teach, right? And so we just said, hey, teach social emotional learning. Good
yeah,
luck.
right.
So, when we partnered with TEAMology, we're like Lamar on leadership. Like, we're intentionally teaching skills that go along with social emotional learning rather than just using the word social emotional learning.
Right. And that's
we
an
do
important
hear
point.
that throughout the school. Let's look at leadership. Remember our story about Lamar. Let's find some examples on leadership. Or Amelia with anti-bullying, going back to her. So because we had the tools, we're able to specifically and intentionally teach those skills on social emotional learning.
Yeah, that's a perfect point.
Yeah, and I think that's been proven over time, right? So going back to, like you said, with Fred and how we've talked about Mr. Rogers and his lessons, and what, media can offer in terms of making those connections and creating those relationships is, a lot of times you can to bridge that home to school connection. We have schools, that are using social and emotional learning that centers around Daniel Tiger and Daniel Tiger's neighborhood, which is the new animated kind of Fred Rogers messages. And teachers will really love that and are grabbing onto that because it's something that's recognizable to the kids. And then it's also something that is translatable to parents.
Yep.
And they see it in their home as well. And so again, it's in the school, it's, we partner with libraries. And so it's really creating those spaces so that the messages are everywhere.
That's great.
And so, I hear all the time, kids are parents and caregivers and grandparents and teachers who are like kind of working in these ecosystems say to me, Daniel Tiger, my kids are singing, when you feel so mad that you run or roar, take a deep breath and count to 4. Like that's kind of becoming a universal language.
That language, that's another key element, language and consistent language that kids understand.
Yeah, and so I
Great
think
point.
just like TEAMology has the characters and, different, there's all kinds of media and all kinds of programs that create those connections.
Yep.
Take characters and then to take that message and make sure that it's embedded in community and that partners are kind of all working together to have that language.
Perfect. Rick had a question. How can student assistant teams take a more proactive approach to social emotional learning rather than being reactive when referrals come in?
I'll take an attempt at that. First of all, I think that's a good example of what Randy had talked about, and also, Justin, the idea of like having a school vision and having structures like student assistant teams and other teams that can take an initiative forward, right? So if you think about it, we had this great sense of urgency, right? The pandemic that's really stimulated some change. And now it's sort of like building the capacity. Well, how do you build the capacity? Well, you take teams of teachers within your system that align with the vision, right? And then you set a set of strategies and develop a common language. And I want to talk about that a little bit because I think Gina made a really important point. Like common language is key. Like we have common language in literacy, we have common language in math, right? So there's this common language around social emotional learning. It's the same thing, right? And we hope that through our school culture and through our curriculum and instruction that we build that knowledge of academic language and social emotional language within our school for everybody, right? And that ecosystem part of it is also about like, how then do you take parents? How do you take community partners? And how do you help them build that same language, right? Because I think the ecosystem thing is going to be a really important concept going forward. If you look at what's happening in STEM in the state of Pennsylvania, there are these ecosystems that involve schools, communities, governing offices, private sector, coming around this common language about STEM. So I think that's going to be really important. And student assistant teams, I think you have to think about them as not necessarily being reactive, right? Because as I think I saw the chat, the person indicated, well, we react to, but a student assistant team can also be really proactive, right? And so I think that's another mindset switch to consider, right? And then how can you as a team look at the goals for social emotional learning you're building, develop a common language, and then have a set of strategies that you're going to help everybody get around.
Great. Thank you, Peggy. Anybody else? Okay. We have a few more questions here. This is from a grandparent. Are schools offering any social and emotional support or training for parents and caregivers? I feel like I look great at Gina for parent support.
Yeah, so there are. I mean, we are working with really closely with the state of Pennsylvania and the PDE. We're working really closely with our local IUs. I think that this was a gap, right, that was identified back in March and April. This, connection to grandparents and parents and caregivers, and how do we bridge that?
Right.
And so the PDE reached out to PBS. So we're one of 7 Pennsylvania public media stations across the state. And we were brought in to help create supports for that. And so through our social media channels, through on-air broadcast. So what's really nice is that we have a pipeline right into homes of caregivers and parents to help create those supports through Ready to Learn and the larger, Corporation Public Broadcasting and the larger Department of Ed work and opportunities. We've been creating parent engagement, and they've been in person, these parent engagement opportunities. But we figured out a way to innovate and shift so that we're offering grab and go kits that have just really quick little cards inside of them that have parent resources and ways parents can engage with their kids. We've switched to virtual online engagement opportunities. Just something as simple as creating a school-wide event that can be virtual. That's a fun screener, right? That you're going to sit down and all watch something together, and then there's a demo of a grab and go activity that you picked up. And so we've been working really closely with the Department of Ed in PA to be able to support schools and to create some of these opportunities for parents, ones that have connectivity and ones that don't. I mean, PA's got some really rural districts that don't have connectivity. And so figuring out ways to be creative and use something fun and new and inventive called data casting, which is coming up on the horizon to reach these families and make sure that they still feel connected. Because we keep going back to this social and emotional wellness is so connected to the relationships that you have.
Absolutely.
And so, so we're working and not just us, but I think again, this is the partnership piece. Like this is where it's so important to make sure that school districts have those connections to all of the people in all of the organizations in their community that are touching parents and caregivers and grandparents on a daily basis. Connections to the libraries, connections to the social services, connections to the museums and the people that are there just to fill in those gaps.
That's amazing work.
Yeah, it's incredible. Is there a website that maybe Elisa could put in the chat Is there a
I
way?
actually feel like we've had it dumped in there. So there's a PA Learning at Home website,
Okay,
a general one. So I know we've got people from all over the state and country and other countries on this webinar today. But so specifically, if you go to palearningathome.org, you can find that website, and then every PA station. So if you're specific to Southwestern PA, has the same collective tag, but
Okay.
ours is like WQED/Learn at Home. So learning at home. So that's kind of how you can find it. But if you search PA Learning at Home, you'll be able to find those resources. And I know Peggy's been working really closely as part of this group too. So she may have a tape.
Yeah, I think this is the data casting is actually going to be piloted in a number of school districts, which is really going to tackle that problem of lack of infrastructure as far as broadband internet. So that's going to be a really big thing. And there will be resources that through the data casting that teachers and parents and community providers can use that hopefully will be aligned in some way so that they know kind of how to pick and choose those resources appropriately. But I do think, there's more work to be done in that area. I mean, if you think about all of the amount of the shift on parents and caregivers, right? Grandparents and aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters, and so forth, that this has created does require us to really think about what is it that we need. So an important part of that, I'll go back to Randy because I'm a data person too, is that school districts are moving in that direction, recognizing that they need to know more about the burdens that have been presented to parents and caregivers and the community in that regard. And they're trying to survey folks now more to go, okay, what is it that parents need? And I'll give you, at the very beginning, it was like really simple things like, what do you prefer, remote learning or hybrid? Well, that's sort of not, that's a big question, not really maybe getting to the deep needs that people need. And now, they're getting better with their questions. They're asking better questions. What do you need to learn about this? Some of it is technology, right? Some of it is, content. I can't teach fourth grade math. This is different than what I learned when I was a kid. And some of it is about how do I address the needs of my child who doesn't really want to sit in front of a computer for a period of time, or who isn't doing their work, who doesn't understand. So I think we're going to start to see more districts as they get a rhythm now with, with what's happening, to be able to start to, take a deeper dive in those areas.
Thank you, Peggy. Anything else? There's just I hope that was very helpful to the grandparents that asked that question.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think that it's also a space in maybe now we're through some of that triage, right? And so I think now we're at a space where that communication between schools and caregivers needs to really start to happen. There needs to be a real dialogue between the schools and what they need caregivers and parents to know,
Right.
and the caregivers and what they need school districts and parents to know. So I think there, now that we've kind of come out like a little bit on the other side of just trying to get through, and I think whatever we learn in this next 9-month period is going to be really important as we shape how things move forward in education. And, I think it's really time to start those conversations and to listen.
Right. The transformation is happening now. See where it goes in the future. That's awesome work. I'm just amazed by the things that you guys are doing. I think we have time for at least one more question here from Keith. Our students who are on a remote learning are having the difficulty of adjusting to the new learning environment of being on camera and having to interact virtually. Is there any advice to get the students to the point where they can feel comfortable enough to allow themselves to be seen on camera from a social emotional lens?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think we have to look at some of the reasons why that may or may not be happening. It might not even be comfort level. It could be as simple as video camera provides enough interference that it breaks down my internet. Could be that there are other people in the house using who are also online, and they just don't have the broadband width to be able to do that. There are some other reasons that I think have to be explored first before we say that a child is not or isn't comfortable. And then there's issues of equity that I think we have to pay attention to too. There are lots of kids who may not feel comfortable revealing to their peers and or to their teacher their home environment. And that's a really important consideration. And while we would all like to see each other, I think that's our preference, to be able to see each other. I think there needs to be some discussion within that school and the district about what are the conditions as to why kids are not, okay? And then think about, is that a requirement? Because sometimes we make these requirements and one size fits all and they don't work for all kids. So think about what I said earlier about how do you design for your most vulnerable kids? So vulnerability could be social emotional, can be poverty, it can be class, it can be race, it can be any of those things, right? And have the conversation about that before you jump onto making and requiring kids to be on, right? Some of it's our comfort. We want to be able to see that person, right? That's our comfort. That's as humans, we want that interaction, right? To see people. But there may be other ways to do that, right? And what might those be, right? And I think that's going to be a really important, question going forward, because equity. So part of this whole thing that we're talking about too with social emotional learning is equity, right? What does that mean for different groups of kids?
Thank you, Peggy. Any other thoughts, Justin, with your students? Have you seen or heard any concerns around students being?
Yeah, before I answer that question, I want to give a huge shout out, if I forget, to Janelle and Aiden behind the camera today.
Yes,
And the microphones. Thank you so much. And Mariana for letting us use this beautiful space. Yes, that question is a question that every district is asking and answering. And so our take on that is very similar to Peggy's take, is that we're a Title I school. But we have kids that have very nice houses, the kids that live in houses where they're, sharing it with an aunt and uncle and relatives and siblings. And so our standpoint was, kids don't have to be on camera because you don't know what the background is. And why are we going to force a student to show their background, to show what they're wearing, or whatever? And so we said, well, it's not an issue. But then the conversation comes up from the educator standpoint, the teachers. Well, I want to make sure students are learning. And so in order for that, I have to see them. Well, a couple of thoughts on that. One, it's kind of what makes school work sometimes and doesn't work when kids are face to face, because we can put those kids hostage in front of us. Like, you have to sit there, you have to listen to me. Well, home, that's not the case. And they said, well, at least I could see their face. So at least it's like hope. Well, on Google Meet, which a lot of schools use,
Right.
I could look on it, freeze my face, and walk away. My face is still there, but I'm not there. So that kind of goes out the door. So then we turn the conversation to, just like anything, well, if your lesson is so interactive and engaging, just like in a school building, kids will be there and kids will collaborate and work with you. In the school building, they may physically be there in front of you, but mentally they may not be there. They may daydream a lot. I mean, I get it from my kids all the time. Like, I was this class today. Honestly, I forget what they said. We've all been there and done it, right? We still as adults do that. But in general, so instead of having the kids show their face and this and that, focus on the lesson, how you're engaging, how are you collaborating students against each other. That was a big shift that we had was, yes, we have kids at home, we have some kids face to face or all kids at home, but how can we set up breakout rooms and places for kids to collaborate, whether it's online, Google Docs, slides, or whatever it is. But there is an equity issue there. I've been in conferences before and webinars where, like Peggy said, hey, everybody, turn your cameras off because we're having some connectivity issues. And those are big webinars. I've presented before where I couldn't ask people to put in chats anymore because it slowed everything down. Again, I think the other point of the conversation is how can we look at it instructionally? We're not sitting at home in this. I mean, how many times as adults, our camera has to be on, and like we're looking at our background, like, uh-oh, I better move. Yeah, it's like, but
Definitely
sometimes you
true.
don't think about. We're asking like 11-year-olds
Yeah.
to do that, who don't think like that.
Or
But
even
other
6,
11-year-olds
7-year-olds.
we're looking at 16, like, wow, look at the back of there, and they're like laughing, and like
Yeah.
I don't get it, but
Yeah.
so.
Thank you. I hope that was helpful, Keith. You're still on. Are there any other, Elisa, are there any other questions that you want to put out to the panelists?
So Lindsay, I have a question for you.
God.
If that's okay.
Hang on a second, Elisa.
Yeah, no
So I think it's important. You've asked a lot of questions today. You did a nice job moderating everybody and keeping the conversation going. But I'm curious to why you started down this path, why you're here, why it's so important to host this fireside chat. It's totally off script, so I
It is
apologize.
totally off script. But great question.
But I'm curious, like, why is this so important to you to not only start a company that addresses this, but also include partners like WQED and other partners?
Sure. Thank you for that question. That's a big question. I could probably be here a long time answering it, but to keep it kind of brief and to the point, my background is education. I will always be an educator at heart and teacher and school counselor. And I actually then was a career counselor in higher ed for a brief time, very short time. But 15 years ago, when I was deciding what I wanted to be when I grew up, maybe a little more than 15 years ago, I realized that my mom was a teacher, so I was in her classroom a lot. And even growing up, connection was always very important to me. I played sports. It was a way that I made a lot of friends and made connections. But I realized going into college and having some of my opportunities to get into the schools that I gravitated towards kids that seemed to need additional help. Maybe is the right word, but additional conversations, or just seemed to need a friend. And I was very curious at the time what schools were doing systemically to help kids feel connected. And I came to learn around that time as a graduate student, actually at Penn State, that there wasn't a lot that was systemically put into place that I could find. And so I was really interested. That kind of triggered my interest into understanding how to be more innovative and bring something to schools that would create an environment or a culture where all schools wanted to be there, regardless of what their what their interests were or what they wanted to be connected to. So that was the start. Kind of fast forward to now, we've had an amazing opportunity as TEAMology to pull intellectual property from Penn State University. So we still maintain that relationship. We're very close with that university, but initially, we worked with a lot of schools around programming and curriculum and training, which was important and still important. But we also realized that there was a need for innovation and technology. We wanted to meet kids where they were, and we continue to want to meet teachers where they are. And so we've established great relationships and partners with people like Gina from WQED, foundations and university. But we realized when the pandemic hit that we couldn't keep doing what we were traditionally doing, which was working with schools, getting into the schools, doing trainings, helping to kind of establish a system and get the curriculum in the hands of the teachers to get the information to the students. But I had a vision a while ago around technology and social emotional, and I just paid a lot of attention to what people were saying. This was a couple years ago, way before the pandemic. And so we had some things in place. We had some ideas in place. We had been talking to different partners, and it kind of March hit, and it was kind of like, we can either keep doing what we've been doing, which isn't going to work. It's not going to get us very far because that's not really what schools need right now. So we really decided to focus a lot more on the technology, which we're going to do a quick demo here really soon. But we also continue to focus on our partnerships. And we also have a reveal in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to have Gina reveal a special guest who's been very patiently waiting. And we saw the two worlds colliding. We saw this traditional approach of social emotional and a path forward with technology, and how, you know, one message I want to say loud and clear is that social emotional, you know, machines can't create relationships. You know, that's always going to be the work of humans, but machines can do other things to get humans to connect. And then we have to, you know, promote that human connection. So I say that to kind of, I guess, lead up to, and thank you again for that question. That was an unexpected question. The long answer, but it leads very nicely up to the end of this event, which is having Elisa, if you could help us do a demo.
Yeah. Let's do it.
So as she's pulling that up, I just want to give a quick kind of introduction to what she's doing. So the technology that I'm speaking of is, you know, we have put a lot of focus on our character Ruby, who promotes resiliency, as you know, because we really felt like Ruby was who our world needed. She really, you know, everybody needed to be resilient, and we all are continuing to need to be resilient. So we started highlighting her and featuring her, and she's been our go-to character to produce the pilot of this technology. And what you're going to see here, and what we've been working on for months now, is the ability for kids to actually have an engagement, interaction, conversation, if you will, with Ruby. And I don't know if you can you move can the panel of the panelists be, can that be moved? There we go. So what you'll see now is that we basically have been working with a variety of schools and students around ideas and ways to develop technology direct to kids. And we've done this in a couple different ways. We partnered with Nittany AI over the summer and the Prevention Research Center at Penn State to pull together a screening to better understand how to gauge resiliency, or where a student is with resiliency. And that's another project that we're continuing down the path to do. And then in addition, this is called our Ruby coaching. We had the ability to have students get in front of Ruby and start communicating. Open dialogue, kind of coaching, we call it. So this is not in place of counseling. This is not a mental health tool necessarily, but it certainly can bridge to those kinds of services. So just looking at the screen, you'll see back and forth what it looks like to talk to Ruby resiliency. And interestingly enough, 100% of students that participated in this pilot reported that after they had gone through the process, that they preferred talking to Ruby again over sharing some of the things they were talking about with the parent, teacher, or counselor. And a simple answer to that is because this really feels very non-judgmental. This is kind of a journal, if you will, of just allowing, you know, but the value of that is tremendous. If a student is struggling, you know, we even had a special ed teacher that shared she would love to do this in like the quiet corner of the classroom, so that we know, you know, when students are super emotional, when we as people are super emotional, our brains don't work the same. So it's hard to learn. It's hard to continue to have a normal day if you don't get a chance to de-escalate, and this could be de-escalation.
And this is something so relevant to students today. And my son gets up in the morning, my daughter, and my other son, it's not even hello dad, it's good morning Google, how are you today?
Hi, Alexa.
They can connect to this. And, what a great tool. So
yeah,
congratulations.
We're super excited about it. We continue, like I said, we have pilots that we are, you know, pretty tight programs right now, but we're looking in the new year to be pushing out our screening to most of the TEAMology schools, and then we'll continue to get information out into world of education the best we can. So with that being said, Gina, if we want to do the big reveal,
Yeah.
so the last exciting thing of the day is Gina and I met about a year ago, maybe a little less than a year ago.
A little bit.
And
Before the pandemic.
Definitely before the pandemic. And I would say we hit it off and had similar thoughts and ideas around education. And kind of long story short, it has led now to a partnership where WQED has started to produce puppets. So if you want to talk a little bit about from your end of the
For sure.
partnership.
So I think when we first started talking to you, you were just talking with Penn State and some of your other partners about developing the AI piece with Ruby. And that resonated so well with me, just from my background in early childhood, from being a classroom teacher. One of the, almost like think of that piece as like kids can talk to inanimate objects, right? Sometimes better and share easier with someone that's not a person of authority or someone that in that kind of a role, or even a parent who, do you know what I mean? Like they may be holding back. And so when we started talking about this stuff, it really made me think about WQED's roots and like where we started at. And it started with this notion that you could use media content to deliver educational messages, right? And the way that started at QED was Fred wasn't there by himself. Mr. McFeely wasn't there by himself, right? Lady Aberlin wasn't there by herself. Fred was teaching his lessons through puppets. When he worked outside of the studio with families and with kids and with children, he brought Daniel with him to help kids connect and tell their stories. And so, you know, I think when you first came to me, you had this kind of idea of perhaps creating something with animation and perhaps doing the media piece. And I had been working with puppeteers on other projects, and it's been going really well, and kids were super receptive to it. And so you were super open to the idea of creating the characters and creating puppets. And so our wonderful friends at Pittsburgh Puppet Works and City Studios have created Ruby as our first puppet, and I have her here today. But we're going to take these characters and we're going to create videos, and we're going to help parents connect to the characters by airing them, by making digital pieces that connect to the platforms that you've created. And the content is so rich and so good, but adding music strategies into them. And so we're super excited about this project. And it's the first time at WQED, I've been there for 7 years. It's the first time that our team has really taken something on like this and, you know, created something for on air. It's totally ours in education that stems from education space. So
cool. Yes,
bring her
over. And I don't know the best camera to put her.
Okay.
Or maybe should we put her up?
Is this good? Can you see her? Back? Here? Kind of too far.
Can everybody see her? Up.
Oh. How about I lift her?
There she is with her amazing chair.
Camera. This way? Here.
There's our Ruby. We love her.
So they've done a great job, and we're super excited. I can't wait to see the other 5 characters.
Oh, so she's so awesome. And yeah, I mean, it's amazing to me. I mean, I said everything just came full circle whenever she came through the door today. So we are so excited to continue down the path of the partnership and to see these characters come to life. I mean, it's amazing. We have so much work ahead of us. That's what I always say.
That's true.
Yeah, we do.
But
feel like Ruby wants to say something.
I know. I mean, she's got a lot to say here soon, but maybe
She'll be
we'll wait.
singing.
She'll be singing. We're gonna get her with her friends and have a lot of influence on hopefully a lot of kids. So, and we can't wait to get the kids' reaction. I think that's what I'm most excited about next. So,
Congratulations, everybody.
yes,
It's a huge deal.
it's a huge deal. Yes, it's a big day.
It is a big day.
Big day.
It's going to be a big year, right?
That's
I think everybody's ready to take this disruption and create permanent, significant change.
I think that's the line of the day,
yes.
the quote of the day.
Thank you, Gina. Any last minute questions or thoughts? But I know we're going to be ending a little bit earlier than planned, but maybe people can.
No, people love the puppets. So everyone's very excited for the puppets from the chat. So I think we're all good.
Yes, you can, Amy.
Yes. I would love to take Ruby into like a classroom if we're
Yeah,
allowed.
and Amy is a puppet person too.
Is-
Oh, good.
Awesome.
And a voice person. So she's our in-house puppeteer. Jeez.
Really?
I like that you have one
I
of those.
know. Not all school districts have an expert puppeteer. Well, thank you all so much, those of you who are still on. And please, Elise, if you want to put our website in the
Yep.
chat, please feel
Will do.
to reach out, learn more from the work from W2ED, Montour School District, TEAMology, and I think on behalf of all of us, we're thrilled that everybody on the call joined us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank you.
thank